At 9:37 in the morning on August 12, 2020, a train derailed in Scotland, precisely here near to the town of Stonehaven. On that fateful day, a nation received the news that a fatal train accident took place on the railway line that runs between Aberdeen and Dundee. For the first time in over a decade, a train not only derailed in a devastating accident, but induced fatal injury. Railway accidents have become exceedingly rare in the United Kingdom in recent years. Coinciding with this, deaths related to the railway have also drastically decreased to nearly zero. Most deaths related to rail accidents in the UK after 2004 have mostly been linked to level crossing incidents. But this never really involved a train going off the rails, with one notable exception in 2007. Needless to say that rail travel in Britain, despite its many flaws, is incredibly safe, which may be why so much attention was drawn to the 2020 derailment at Carmont in Scotland. It immediately became headline news across the country. It was the first major rail accident in years. It should be noted that this could have been a far greater tragedy than it already was. Occurring in 2020 at the height of the coronavirus pandemic, the number of rail travelers at that time were limited in numbers. This is the story of the Stonehaven Derailment. We'll explore what happened here and the events leading up to that fatal accident. We need to get some preliminary information out of the way. To dissect this accident with the appropriate level of detail, we should familiarize ourselves with the train involved and the region in which it operated, so the track and route of its final journey. Firstly, the train. It was operated under ScotRail, a railway franchise in the United Kingdom that, as its name suggests, relates to services exclusively within Scotland, aside from a regional service that terminates in Carlisle. Today, the ScotRail franchise is run under the Scottish Government following the collapse of the franchise's previous private owner, Abellio ScotRail. They failed to adequately run the rail services, so in 2022, it was taken under public ownership. So, at the time of the accident we're discussing, ScotRail services were run under Abellio ScotRail, a private company. But for the sake of brevity, we'll just use ScotRail going forward in this video. ScotRail has a variety of different trains, locomotives and rolling stock that make up their fleet. They have regional services all across Scotland, but they also have an intercity fleet that connects the major cities in the country, something that ScotRail calls Inter-Seven City. A set of rail services that run from Glasgow and Edinburgh all the way up to Inverness in the Highlands, notably via Aberdeen. Let's take a moment to introduce the train that had been employed to fulfill the Inter-Seven City, and was introduced onto the ScotRail network in 2018. This is the Intercity 125 high-speed train, often abbreviated to just HST. This is a beloved train amongst railway enthusiasts in the United Kingdom. Developed in the 1970s within the UK itself, the HSTs served to reinvent the British railways and replace many of the aging trains and locomotives that were still on the country's rail network at the time. The power cars are British Rail Class 43 locomotives. These things are actually amongst the fastest diesel locomotives in the entire world. The units were originally powered by Paxman Valenta engines that really helped cement the train's dominance over the railways in the 1980s. If, like me, you were a railway enjoyer growing up in the United Kingdom, there is one thing that I associate with this train. The one thing I'll never forget about those Valenta engines, and that was the fact that they were extremely loud, almost as if the thing was screaming when it was powered up. The engines have been replaced over the years with German-manufactured MTU engines, which has helped give these locomotives a longer lifespan. That's the thing, they have been around for a long time now, and many units have faced retirement. The original HST now actually sits in the National Railway Museum in York, which I was able to visit during research of this video. The power cars alone a train does not make. British Rail had the foresight to develop a set of coaches to go along with the Class 43 units. Intercity 125 trains usually consist of 2 power cars, one at each end, with a rake of British Rail Mark III coaches in between, the number of which varied depending on what part of the rail network they were operating on. HSTs on the East Coast Main Line, for example, operated with as many as 9 coaches. ScotRail, when they inherited the trains from Great Western in 2018, they operated the trains with just 4 coaches as standard. The coaches themselves by this time had also been developed further to extend their life. One of the more noticeable changes in recent years was the change to the doors that now slide open to conform with newer accessibility standards. ScotRail's Inter-7 City services are amongst the last rail services in the United Kingdom as a whole where the Intercity 125s are common. Even just a few years ago at the time of the Stonehaven accident, HSTs could still be spotted in various places across the country, but retirement has since continued and accelerated. Let's try to not get too off topic here. This is our train, Intercity 125, 2 power cars, 4 Mark III coaches. The accident train featured the locomotives numbered as 43030 and 43140. This was the accident train. On the morning of August 12, 2020, it was to perform a route leaving Aberdeen terminating at Glasgow Queen Street Station. The train was given a reporting number, 1 Tango 08, and will now be referred to as such throughout this video. At this point though, I don't believe we are quite ready to break down the events of that morning leading to disaster. You see, the thing is, even before the train left on its final journey that morning, things already weren't going well. If we take a step back and look at the bigger picture here, we can see the beginning of where things went wrong in this accident. It was raining, a lot actually. The weather was extremely poor, even by Scotland standards. We have looked at weather conditions many times on the channel, but never into how that could affect rail travel and trains. So before we look into the journey of the accident train, this is something we just need to get out of the way. We do need to get a better grasp on the weather at the time and the infrastructure at the site of the accident that was installed to deal with said weather. We need to look at the hours preceding the accident, going back into August 11th. Now, August 11th for much of Scotland was actually a rather pleasant day, albeit a bit cloudy in some areas. This all changed in the evening, when a weather system bringing continuous heavy rains was brought north into Scotland. Scotland received the brunt of this weather, with much of the severe weather accumulating over eastern Scotland. The Met Office, that is the British National Weather Service, had issued an amber warning for this region, suggesting it could be hit with up to 60 to 80 millimeters of rain in the span of just a few hours, with the possibility of thunderstorms and, spoiler, there were severe thunderstorms. At 11:28 that night, the Met Office took to Twitter and published this tweet.
No, Elon, I won't be calling it that.
The Met Office was so kind to provide us with this animation detailing their forecast for the weather. Now, the reason why I'm using Twitter as a source here is because the best part about this is that because this is a tweet, we also have replies. Comments from Scottish locals suggest this type of extreme rainfall was abnormal, even for Scotland. The data in post-accident analysis backs this up. The Rail Accident Investigation Branch later reported that meteorologists from their analysis of what happened that night suggest that what happened in Scotland during this time was a once-in-100-year event, this kind of severe downpour. The point is, that was a bad night for Scotland in terms of weather. There was flooding and major disruption to infrastructure, including rail services. Many ScotRail services the following day would either be cancelled or diverted. Blockages, landslides, and other anomalies were reported all over Scotland. Some areas of the country reported receiving 100 millimeters of rainfall, enabling flooding of the railway lines. Stonehaven in Aberdeenshire received about 79 millimeters, with specifically 51.5 millimeters, that's just over 2 inches of rainfall, recorded at Carmont, which was where the accident ultimately occurred. The severity of this weather would taper off as the night progressed, but the rains sustained, well into the morning, with continuous downpours affecting eastern Scotland. Having now familiarised ourselves with the local weather preceding the accident, how did this affect the railway between Aberdeen and Dundee? Well, here's the thing. That section of track at Carmont, historically, had been known to be a hazard in severe rainfall. A train had actually derailed there in 1915 after hitting a landslide induced by heavy rains. That incident was non-fatal, but problems here persisted over the years. Landslides do occasionally happen and can obstruct the railway. Obviously, this is an issue, one that rail operators all over the world try to prevent. One way to do that is to install appropriate drainage systems so that train tracks can be kept free of excess water and debris that could ultimately wash out onto the track. Many moons ago, Carmont was fitted with a drain. However, that section of track needed to be closed in 2002, again following a landslide which had obstructed the track, the culprit being heavy rains and strong winds. Network Rail, the company who manages the rail infrastructure in Britain, identified the need for improvements at the site to address this known issue of potential flooding and landslides. In 2011 and 2012, work was done to allow for a better drainage system to be installed here. This would make the track safer, mitigate disruption caused by flooding, and decrease the likelihood of a landslide making its way onto the tracks. Network Rail says this was carried out, confirming that improvements had been made at Carmont in a report published in 2014. Now, it's this drainage system that is pretty much at the center of this accident. It would not perform as it needed to. The general design of the drain system that was installed here was capable of handling all of that excess rainfall that fell throughout the preceding night and the heavy rains on the morning of August 12th. What the Rail Accident Investigation Branch later concluded, though, was that the construction of the drainage system was at fault, not necessarily the design. So that begs the question, who constructed the drain system at Carmont? Because it wasn't Network Rail or ScotRail. The job was outsourced. So, who did the work? And what did they actually do? I think it's time we introduce another company into the mix. Enter Carillion. Carillion was a construction and civil engineering company headquartered in the United Kingdom. Carillion was brought in as a construction contractor on various infrastructure projects, not just in the United Kingdom but also internationally. Some of their most notable projects of which include a satellite concourse for Heathrow Terminal 5, the Copenhagen Metro, and High Speed 1. Carillion, founded in 1999 following a demerger from a larger company, rose to prominence in the British construction industry. The company was awarded countless numbers of construction contracts by the British government, leading to massive growth throughout the 2000s and 2010s. The company had developed a negative reputation for their questionable business practices, including cost-cutting on construction projects and union busting. Now, we're not here to look into all of the shenanigans that Carillion has been involved in over the years, so we're not going to go too deep into that here. However, and I'm sure that there are many Brits in the audience that are aware of this, Carillion was in the news just a few years ago, shutting its doors. A now defunct company, Carillion collapsed in 2018. The company had collected a massive amount of debt. Chronic mismanagement, financial difficulties, and just flat-out greed all contributed to the company's collapse. The penny-pinching practices of Carillion manifested in some of the work done by the company. Network Rail contracted with Carillion for a multitude of projects on the railway over the years. Among those rail projects given to them by Network Rail was to install a new drain system at Carmont. Carillion, in what can be read as an effort to cut cost and save time associated with the project, deviated from the required design of the drainage system. In order to see this in better detail, we're going to need to look at Carmont and what was actually put there in terms of drainage. So let's go to the map. This is a rather bendy section of the line. The two parallel lines weave one way and then the other way, with bends around the terrain, including a large embankment highlighted here. You can see this better in this photograph that's annotated in the RAIB's report. Prior to Carillion's involvement with the drain, Surface water here would flow down the natural funnel structure of the landscape. A trackside trench would then collect the water and take it down to nearby Carmont water. This allowed water to naturally flow and be channeled into the drain that had previously been constructed here. In 2009, Carillion was brought in to make improvements to this drainage system. What they did was install a new drain that followed the contours of the embankment, connecting onto a burn. A trench was constructed that was filled with gravel. Carillion installed a perforated pipe and a series of catch pits beneath the stones. This new drain would connect to the already existing one and again transport the contents to Carmont water. Trains actually pass over this river via a small bridge. Deviating from the designer's original plans for the drain, Carillion had decided to make a number of changes, perhaps the most notable of which included the construction of what is called a bund, a construction technique that is used to contain fluid and prevent spillages. The bund was built perpendicular to the gravel trench containing the perforated drain installed on the funnel feature of the embankment. What this did was manipulate the flow of surface water coming down the embankment and channeled it into their new drain about here. This was done outside of Network Rail's land, just far enough away it was outside of their responsibility. The Rail Accident Investigation Branch would later find no evidence that Carillion had notified Network Rail of this change, or even consulted Arup, which was the company who designed the drain for that area. To quote the investigation on this bund, which was constructed outside of Network Rail's land, had the effect of diverting a large amount of water into a gully, so that it all reached the drain at the same location, thereby increasing the propensity for a washout of the gravel infill. RAIB found no evidence that the construction of the bund was notified to Network Rail or the designer. The investigative report is also quick to mention the numerous other changes from the designer's intentions, failing to connect the drain to the previous drainage system, failing to install the necessary lining on the perforated drain to prevent the entry of debris potentially clogging the pipe, relocating a catch pit, and leaving a bend in the drain so that it didn't coincide with said catch pit. Carillion finished their work here in 2012. Network Rail, who contracted with Carillion, never checked in on what they had done. The investigation found that Network Rail's own audits of contracted construction work did not include checks with the intention of finding the modifications like the ones Carillion made to this drain. Because of this, management at Network Rail were likely unaware that this drainage system was now built against the intention of its original design. So there the drain stayed, for years. No one picked up on it, no one even thought it was built faulty to the point it could contribute to a rail disaster. It was never inspected, no maintenance work was ever carried out on it. It is stated in multiple reports that a landowner nearby did contact both Network Rail and Carillion about the buildup of surface water in the area. However, a follow-through on this lead was never picked up. The drain lasted nearly 8 years, actually outliving the company who made it. The Carillion company collapsed in a huge corporate scandal that was headline news across the country in 2018. Though there was no more Carillion, their drain still sat there. It lasted until that fateful storm in August 2020. So, with all of this information, having looked at the drain system at the site of the accident and gaining the meteorological context, let's move on to the accident's events. August 12, 2020. Train 1 Tango 08 leaves Aberdeen on time for the 6:38 service to Glasgow Queen Street. The train's first stop wouldn't be until it reached Dundee. On board the train are a total of just 9 people, a far lower number than usual. 7 passengers and 2 train crew. Commanding the train that morning was 45-year-old train driver Brett McCulloch. 58-year-old train conductor Donald Dinny was also on the train. Amongst the few passengers was actually another ScotRail employee on their way to work. The low number of passengers was attributed to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic at the time. Aberdeen was under lockdown, so demand for rail travel was substantially low. The Aberdeen to Dundee line takes the train south of Aberdeen towards and through the coastal town of Stonehaven. The train is now on its way towards Carmont. It actually passes the site of the accident and continues further on. This will make sense soon, I promise. At this point, there was no obstruction on the railway at that time. Further down the track is a level crossing and the Carmont signal box. We even have CCTV footage from the driver's cab as the train passed this point. You can even see another train here on the other line. At 6:59, a message was transmitted to 1 Tango 08 from the Carmont signal box, telling them to stop. Multiple landslides and flooding had blocked the train line further down the track, meaning it couldn't really continue its journey. The train was brought to a stop, and it was now stranded. At 7:18, following communication between control staff and the Carmont signaller with regards to concern over the stranded passengers, it was decided that the train should cancel its journey and return to Aberdeen, and it was within that return trip that the accident occurred at Carmont. However, we still have a discrepancy of 2 hours between then and the accident. You see, there was an issue. For the train to return, it needed to swap lines. There were a set of points that would transfer the intercity train onto the parallel northbound track. The issue was that the points needed to be clamped. As a result of needing to wait for this change, 1 Tango 08 would stay put at this point for over 2 hours. During that time, between the train originally passing Carmont and its return trip, nature finally succeeded in destroying Carillion's drainage system on that embankment. The excessive surface water brought on by continuous rainfall began to wash the gravel inside of the drainage trench away and carry it down toward track level. Water eroded the trench, washing away large amounts of earth material, even leaving the perforated pipe exposed to the outside as seen in this photograph. What this meant was that gravel and earth debris had washed onto the railway. This photograph, taken at track level after the accident, shows how this had obstructed the rails. At 9:33, 1 Tango 08 began travelling north, heading back to Aberdeen, switching over to the northbound track at 9:36. By this point, the rainy weather had subsided and the sun even emerged from behind the clouds. That didn't matter at this point. The debris had already washed onto the track. At no point was the driver told to slow down, so he kept to the usual speed restrictions. The driver increases the speed up to the normal speed limit for that section of track, 75 miles per hour or 120 kilometers per hour. The stage was set for disaster. No one knew the drain at Carmont had failed. The driver of 1 Tango 08 also would not have been able to see the obstruction on the line as it was now hiding behind the bend. The train returning north once again passed the Carmont signal box. The signaller gave no caution to the driver. Why would he? He didn't know what lied ahead. The train continued up the track, came around the bend, and at 9:37 came into contact with the debris now on the track. The front power car obviously derailed first. The gravel and earth debris lifted the train's wheels as the flanges could no longer keep the locomotive on the rails. The power car derailed to the left whilst travelling at precisely 73 miles per hour. Now to the left of the rail, just ahead of the train, was a small bridge that brings trains over Carron water. The power car impacted the parapet of the bridge, and the remaining momentum of the train carries the power car to the other side of the river. As it impacts the ground, the train's cab was thrown further ahead. The driver was killed. As for the rest of the train, the coaches began to swerve off the rails. The front 3 of 4 coaches went completely off the rails. The first coach turned onto its back and was crushed by coaches 2 and 4, whilst coach 3 fell down the embankment with the front power car. The wreckage erupted into flames as the train came to a halt. When first responders and rescuers got to the site of the accident, they found there were a total of 3 deaths. Driver Brett McCulloch, conductor Donald Dinney, and 1 passenger, 62-year-old Christopher Stutchbury. This did leave 6 survivors, 3 of which suffered severe injuries. It really needs to be re-highlighted that this already fatal accident could have been so much worse. If it wasn't for the fact that the train was lightly filled due to the pandemic, It's well within the realm of possibility that this could have been one of the worst rail disasters to have ever occurred in Britain. Thousands of rail travellers use this section of track between these major cities every day, especially during the summer season. The British Rail Mark III coaches in standard class configuration can seat 74 people each, not counting standing occupants. The Rail Accident Investigation Branch investigated the accident, and they not only sought to gain an understanding into how the accident unfolded, but to also identify the wider contributing issues and look into how safety could be improved. Following an investigation lasting over a year, the final report was released in 2022. Investigators absolved the driver or any one specific individual on the railway that day of any responsibility in the crash. A number of factors had been identified in contributing to the accident, not least of which was the role of Carillion and their poor construction practices when it came to the construction of the drain they had built. Further contributing factors included the mounting pressure on railway workers that day and the actual age of the train. Investigators gave 20 safety recommendations in the areas of rail management, procedures regarding extreme rainfall, and reviewing of the structural elements of trains on the railway. Network Rail was also reprimanded for their involvement. To quote the investigation, Network Rail's management processes had not addressed weaknesses in the way it mitigated the consequences of extreme rainfall events. Many people also asked a rather simple question, that being whether any trains should have been running in the first place. There is currently an ongoing case here. It has been revealed that in 2023, Network Rail was to face health and safety charges in relation to the accident, though reports also seem to indicate that no corporate homicide charges will be brought against them. As for what happens with Carillion, however, well, the company no longer exists. That is a situation that I find really hard to comment on. Since the accident, with the help of the findings in the investigation, Network Rail has carried out numerous checks on drains all over the country. Rail travel, as a result, has been made just that little bit safer. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to be subscribed so that you don't miss our next video, which I have now started putting together actually. Next time we're going to be taking on a pretty big one, so I'm not really sure how long it's going to take to make. In the meantime though, do let me know what your thoughts were on this episode. We haven't looked at a rail accident in quite a long time, and I think I needed the change after the last video. If this video does well and more people want to see them, we'll absolutely do more train-related videos. Usually the holdup with the rail videos is the lack of resources in the area of train simulation. Not to mention the simulators that are on the market are a bit clunky in my own experience. Anyway, I must take a moment to thank my amazing patrons over on Patreon who have continued to make generous contributions to the channel. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you see your name here, a massive thanks to you. Shoutouts today, a thank you to Fenris who pledged at the £5 tier, and big thanks to Leah Hayden Moores who pledged at the highest tier. I really do appreciate that. What a legend. If you, yourself, would like to support the channel further, you can always join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new videos 2 days ahead of a public release. That is where I'm going to end things today. My personal Twitter will also be linked in the pinned comment, but thank you all so much for watching, and I shall see you next time. Goodbye!